Here we go.
Luckily our child is still
Hello.
not too cool.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to everyone at home who's joining us on live stream. Welcome to everybody who's here today to our Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice. We are thrilled to have Andrew Renolds here today presenting for us in partnership with the Historical Society of Princeton and all of the incredible things that you are going to learn about Hobey Baker. So I'm going to turn it over to our hosts here, and stay tuned at the end. I'll fill in some more information about programs and upcoming things at our space, our intersectional community activist hub, safe space, and welcoming community center. So Liz, take it away.
All right, I'll let Mac walk through with some water. He needs to bring some water, or they water up here. So thank you everybody for coming. This is our discussion with Andrew Renolds about the Searching for Hobey Baker podcast. Jeff over here did all of the enormous legwork that has us here today in orchestrating this event. I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I just wanted to say, I guess, that this is a perfect occasion to be doing this program. It is October, which is LGBTQ History Month, and when we discuss history, it's not just known history, it's history that's constantly being discovered, history that's been suppressed, and that is a lot of what the marginalized communities have experienced in their own histories. So this is a perfect occasion to bring these facts and these findings to light. So Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add?
Oh, I'm just very excited to hear it. Having skated at Hobey Baker Rink for half of its 101 years, I'm excited to learn more about the true history behind Hobey Baker.
I assume Andrew's going to give some backstory on Hobey, so we won't jump into that, but Andrew will be giving a presentation on the podcast, his production, and then we'll have a discussion, a Q&A afterwards. Does that work for everyone? Yeah. All right, so Andrew Renolds.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for having me here today. It's really nice to have a platform, and I moved here in 2020, and the Bayard Rustin Center and High Tops and other organizations have been so special and important, not just me, to my family as well. My 15-year-old daughter, who is now 15, spent seemingly most of her time at High Tops, and has increasingly been participating in Bayard Rustin Center activities, and of course such a fabulous, important and special man as Bayard Rustin was. It's really an honor to speak to you here. I don't know sort of whether you're expecting a sports talk, a hockey talk, a queer talk, a sort of deep dive history talk, but I will ask you, who here has listened to the podcast? Okay, so somebody. I should tell you that my co my co-author and producer Tim Smith and I just signed a deal with Simon & Schuster, which we're very excited about, for the Hobey and Percy book, which is a much more deep dive into the history, the context of these people, their lives, and the society that they navigated. And one thing that I heard, and I can't quite remember who said it, but this is not about rewriting history. It's about writing history. It's about merely telling the truth about something that was long suppressed or hidden or swept under the carpet for a lot of reasons. And those things are still being swept under the carpet. When we get to the discussion section, maybe you can ask me about the NHL's reaction to this podcast, which has been interesting to say the least. And ESPN owned the NHL hockey rights, and the relationship between ESPN and the NHL was somewhat frayed by this podcast. So it's still an ongoing issue, and we can talk about the legacy of same-sex loving people in sports today. And of course, you will all understand, if you have family or yourselves play hockey, hockey is not renowned for its inclusivity across the board. And we can talk somewhat about that. So yes, some of you have heard the podcast. We did a podcast with ESPN, 30 for 30. And what I thought I'd do is take you through, I mean, you've heard the podcast, and you probably know a little bit about Hobey's life, but it's nice, at least for me, to see this man and see what he did. The pictures, he's such a visual character. You know, people see him as this sort of godlike Adonis figure, and they did at the time. So actually seeing him is very special. And you'll remember from the podcast that Hobey really was reared at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. And this is actually Hobey here. You can see him in the middle, playing on the frozen ponds at St. Paul's between 1901 and 1910. And St. Paul's was really the cradle of hockey in America. They had a couple of schoolmasters that went to Canada, brought back real sticks, real pucks. They were literally using tree branches before then, and effectively was the birthplace of hockey in America. And Canada was the dominant hockey playing country at the time. And Hobey, as you know, went to St. Paul's, and St. Paul's produced the great and the good of American white Anglo-Saxon society at the time. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Kennedys, William Randolph Hearst, all the way up to Robert Mueller and John Kerry, the senator. St. Paul's is a very elite school, and at that time there was only a couple of hundred kids at St. Paul's. One of the great things about Hobey, and he was clearly, I'm not a hockey player, my own country is not renowned for its ice hockey. I'm from London, England originally, but he was clearly a remarkable phenomenon in the hockey world. And partly he honed his skills by just skating for hours and hours in the dark. And he developed the ability to not look at the puck at all. He didn't have to look at the puck because he went out after dark and kept on playing, skating. And he was an incredibly kindly child at this school. Sort of otherworldly, preternaturally kind and good. One of his best friends, and this will come back in our story, was a guy called Alexander Cadwallader. And ironically, because the B and the C, they sat next to each other at St. Paul's. And these are their scores. If you study it closely, you'll see that Alex may have been more academic than Hobey at St. Paul's at the time. But they were best friends. And they were renowned as best friends by schoolmasters and others for the whole period of 6 years when they were both in the school together. Now, at St. Paul's, the hockey team in 1909 took on the varsity teams. So the St. Paul's prep school kids took on Harvard and Yale and Princeton and beat them all. And it was, at the time, a great sporting achievement covered by all the papers. And Hobey was by far the dominant player on the St. Paul's team. So everybody recognized he was just a phenomenal athlete, and he could do things that nobody else could do. So in 1910, he follows his father, who went to Princeton, Alfred Baker, to Princeton, and the plan was for both Thornton, Hobey's brother, a year older, and Hobey to go to Princeton. But Alfred's furnishing business had collapsed, and only one boy could go to Princeton. And Thornton, the older brother, said, Hobey is such a phenomenon, he should go, not me. And Thornton went to run the family business in Philadelphia. So Hobey arrives on campus, and he immediately established himself as the most remarkable athlete and the big man on campus. He is adored by everybody. There's a kid living over there in the Peacock Inn who comes over and just worships Hobey, 2 years younger. And he says, this is the most iconic person I've ever seen. And that kid was F. Scott Fitzgerald, who then writes Hobey into his first two books, This Side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby. And Hobey, had a flair for the appearance of being, everybody look at me, even though he was humble and he wasn't really extroverted in that way. He played football, and this is against Syracuse. This could almost be a photograph from, a couple of years ago. But there's Hobey on the football field, his blonde hair flying. And again, at this time, Ivy League sports were king. There was no NFL, there was no NHL, there was no other dominant sports. And the papers, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, all the papers were possessed by Ivy League sports and Hobey as the king of Ivy League sports. You can see here, he's in the hockey team, always looking, pretty stunning man. He was only 5'9", he was 160 pounds. He wasn't big, but he was adored by everybody. And as I said, the newspapers really saw him as a sort of Michael Jordan of the time, a massive football playing hero, a massive hockey playing hero. He was the personification of the great elite Ivy League sportsman. But he could do everything else. He was on the baseball team. He's looking a little James Dean-like in the center of the baseball team there. He was on the rowing team. He was gymnastics. He could do everything. We have a story in the podcast where he walked past one of the buildings on campus and they were practicing rifle range shooting. He'd never picked up a gun before. In 2 hours, he qualified for the team. He was just incredible. He was something of a speaker, but he was quite introverted and sort of a regular B grade student. He was also, one of the things that the metaphors that I think is interesting about Hobey is that he loved to fly, whether it was on the ice, whether it was on the football field, whether it was running around the balustrade of the Plaza Hotel in New York by Central Park, where he ran around the little outside after a dinner party and did it twice. Could have fallen to his death at any stage, but he wasn't drunk or anything. He just loved flying, the danger of that. Now, as many of you know, if you've heard the podcast, we have a new character that comes into the story, a man 9 years older than Percy. Oftentimes, people perceive Percy to be much older than Hobey, and this is actually where we get into some issues about the perception of same-sex love and gay men and bisexual men, in the sense that we see pictures of Hobey when he was a teenager, effectively. And we see pictures of Percy when he was in his 30s and 40s. So we don't actually see pictures of them at comparative ages. This is Percy Rivington Pine in graduation from Princeton in 1903. And we can see him as he gets older. Percy also dresses older, he looks older, but he's actually only 9 years older than Hobey. Now, for any of you who know anything about Princeton, you know that Pines are a massive family in the history of Princeton. You cannot move for a Pine Hall. Pines everywhere. And they own the Drumthwacket House. The Moses Taylor Pine, Percy's father, was effectively the bank for Princeton from about 1880 to the 1920s. Moses Taylor Pine hired and fired presidents. I was just actually today in the special collections reading through the correspondence about the setting up of the graduate school, where Woodrow Wilson wanted it on campus to keep an eye on it, and Moses Taylor Pine wanted it over by the golf course so it could be separate, another source of power. And Moses Taylor Pine beat Woodrow Wilson and replaced him as president with Hibbard. So you have this family, the Pines. Here is Percy playing golf with President Harding. And Percy himself, as you probably heard in the podcast or you may have read, was a fabulously flamboyant Liberace figure. I mean, in the world of closets, this man had no closet. He was gloriously gay, very Anglo-centric. He loved the British Anglo airs and graces. At this time, the Pines were about the 7th wealthiest family in America, not insignificant. So Percy and his family were very, very wealthy, and Percy established clubs, the Ivy Club on campus, hundreds of clubs, and was member of about 35 clubs across New York and Philadelphia and Princeton. So they live in Drumthwacket, and Percy, of course, befriends Hobey. And even at the time, there are lots of contemporaries of Hobey and his friends and roommates and teammates that are uncomfortable with the closeness of Percy and Hobey. They say Percy likes to surround himself with muscular, athletic young men. And it's true, but what's also true is that we have no other evidence, I don't like using the word evidence, but we have no other evidence of Percy in a relationship with anybody else, apart from Hobey Baker. But as I said, Moses Taylor Pine was really the driving force behind the university. Moses Taylor Pine chose the Gothic architecture here. Moses Taylor Pine funded most of the buildings, and he transformed it from the College of New Jersey into Princeton University. Their money came originally from sugar, from Cuba, the railways, and the Citibank of New York, Citibank. After graduation in 1914, and this is something that the Historical Society brought along with us today, Hobey and his friend Ralph Bourne, his classmate, go on a motorcycle tour of Europe. And they're in London when war is declared in 1914, and they immediately attempt to enlist in the British Army. And remarkably, a Princeton professor, Augustus Trowbridge, who they're staying with, stops them and says, "You cannot do that. You will embarrass your mentor, Woodrow Wilson, who is the president, keeping us out of war." And they're like, "Oh." And so they get on a ship and come back to America. But they're desperate to get into the war. And as Hobey's life it hits this post-graduation period, he's not sure what to do. And Percy says, "Come live with me. I have a good setup. I have a mansion in Long Island, the Gatsby Mansion. I have a house on Madison Avenue, and I have Drumthwacket." And Hobey and Percy live together. This is the only photograph we have of Hobey and Percy. It's at the opening of Payne Whitney's tennis courts in Long Island. And I claim credit for finding this because I was going through the scrapbooks in the library and I saw this group photograph and I thought, oh my goodness, that's Hobey and Percy. And no one has ever found a photograph of them together, but you can see Hobey there and Percy on the front. Now, while Hobey is working at JP Morgan, literally for Julius Pierpont Morgan, in the basement, clipping coupons, bored out of his head, he's, at the weekends and the evenings, motor racing, going to parties, and playing at the St. Nicholas Hockey Club in Manhattan which is on 66th, 67th West Side, where the ABC studios are today. And again, people come to watch Hobey play like it's the opera. They come in their pearls, they come in their fur coats, they come in their suits and top hats, and it's a huge thing to see Hobey Baker play. And sometimes the awning says, Hobey Baker and the others play tonight. And Hobey is appalled. He actually refuses to play until they take this down, because he doesn't like the attention just on himself. He races cars at Sheepshead Bay against Eddie Rickenbacker, who becomes the most famous World War I American ace. And by 1916, Hobey's getting bored. Now, I've got to remember this, but Orville and Wilbur Wright take up the first plane when? What year? 1900? Historians are there. 1903? 10 years later, you can jump. 10 years later, for the audience, there's people online. 10 years later, 15 years later, Hobey is learning how to fly. And he's learning how to fly with other very wealthy young men. Seth Low, the son of the mayor of New York, Seth Low, and Quinton Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt. They do the first ever flyover of a football game. They fly down from New York. Two of them don't make it. They just land. They run out of fuel. But the other, including Quinton Roosevelt and Hobey, fly to the Princeton game. They fly around over the top of it. Everyone's like, oh my goodness, this is going to be like NBC in 100 years. And they land at the Princeton airport, and then they get a car over. And Hobey is welcomed by 80,000 people who cheer his name. 1917, finally, and obviously I'm rushing through this, but 1917, finally America enters the war. And Percy takes Hobey to the ship, the Ordana, to sail to England. And Hobey writes his first letter to Percy, which is an incredibly heartfelt letter about how he thanks and appreciates Percy for all his love and affection, and he doesn't know what he will do without him. And this is one of over 120 letters that Hobey sends to Percy and his father over the next year from France and the First World War. Hobey doesn't have a plane for 6 months. The Americans don't have planes. They have pilots but no planes or mechanics. So he hangs out. He hangs out with his friend, Cole Porter, who he knew at Yale, because Cole Porter was at Yale. Cole Porter was actually a cheerleader at Yale, which I find super gay, but let's go. And so at Paris, Hobey sings with Cole Porter, and they hang out during the lull when Hobey is not able to fly and fight on the front. And this is the point where we read the letters, full of affection, full of longing. And if you've heard the podcast, you know that we asked experts on LGBTQ history of this period to say, okay, here's all the stuff. Here's the letters. Here's the life that we have. Do you think they were a couple? And our experts, beyond the ones we talked to in the podcast, said yes, of course. If you saw this type of relationship between a man and a woman, you would assume, of course, they're a couple, a romantic couple. We don't know exactly what the dynamic was, but they're a couple. In fact, it's double standards to see all this evidence without accepting that this is a love between two men. And all of our experts said we think it's a sexual relationship, a very deep romantic relationship between these two men. Hobey is now the great American hero overseas. The sports star become the war hero. He shoots down 3 German planes. He becomes the squadron commander in his number 2 SPAD plane. And he's only really fighting in the air for about 3 months in 1918. But he's pretty successful. And again, the newspapers across the states see him as a great, heroic American star. They write poems about him. They sort of combine this sort of Pat Tillman-like imagery of sporting star and war hero. even, Hobey is a bit of a zealot figure. He just touches all these lives. I couldn't believe it, but he lived with Rin Tin Tin. The dog, literally. So Corporal Duncan found a German Shepherd kennel on the front lines. He found 2 little puppies and the mother. He gave the mother away. He called one Nanette, the other Rin Tin Tin. He was on the same base as Hobey. So Hobey lived with Rin Tin Tin. That is Rin Tin Tin as a puppy who saved Hollywood. Like Hobey and Rin Tin Tin were, I don't want to talk about relationships because I know some people might question, the weirdness of relationships. But no, Rin Tin Tin and Hobey were living together as well. Now here is where we get something interesting. And something that, of course, has coloured our view of Hobey Baker over the last century. At a Cole Porter party, Cole Porter and his wife, Linda Lee Thomas, introduce Hobey to Mimi Scott, an heiress. Now, Cole Porter married Linda Lee Thomas. They had a very good relationship, but obviously Cole Porter was a gay man. Mimi Scott was introduced to Hobey, and I was looking at, you won't be surprised by this, but I was looking at the oral history project of Princeton LGBT graduates. Everybody up until about the 1960s married. Gay Princeton graduates married women. That was the done thing. It was very unusual as a gay man, or even a bisexual man, not to marry a woman. And so it was something that had to be done. And Hobey was introduced and became engaged to Mimi Scott, who was a wealthy heiress, and she was a Red Cross nurse in Paris at the time. This is one of the last photographs we have of Hobey in November 1918 with Charles Dolive, who was one of his closer friends from Princeton as well. And Mimi breaks off the engagement. And this is important because when Hobey died, and that's a plot spoiler, I know, but when Hobey died, some people said, well, maybe he was despondent about Mimi breaking off the engagement. Mimi broke off the engagement and married a guy called Philander Cable, who was a diplomat, who turned out to be a gay man. She then went on to marry a man called Paul Lennon, who was also a gay man, who also, in Manny Marable's autobiography of Malcolm X, pointed out that when Malcolm X was a young man, he performed sexual favours for Mimi Scott's husband, Paul Lennon, in Boston. So it's again a remarkable zealot type touching 3 degrees of separation. Now I want to take us away from the sports a little bit to the context of the time. And I am surprised at how I think a lot of people here in this town don't realize how it was at the time the center of the eugenics race science movement. And Hobey and Percy were living literally with the leaders of the eugenics race science movement. Moses Taylor Pine, Percy's father, the drum thwacket owner, the Princeton controller in effect, was really the 5th man of the eugenics movement. Charles Davenport from the Eugenics Record Office was very close to Moses Taylor. Henry Fairfield Osborne was Moses Taylor Pine's best friend. They graduated together from Princeton in 1877. Osborne founded the American Museum of Natural History, but also wrote some of the leading tracts about eugenics. And I'll tell you what this is in a second. Madison Grant, again, was very close to Moses. And Madison Grant published a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which was incredibly influential in America and was edited and basically contributed to by Moses Taylor Pine as well. And then Harry Laughlin was a Princeton PhD from 1917, and he was heading the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Harbor Springs in New York. You can see The Passing of the Great Race, which was, at the time was the template for white supremacy in America, was every edition, Moses Taylor Pine was thanked for that. So Moses is living with Percy and Hobey. And what's this dynamic there? So the eugenics, basically, they said attributes were determined by race, not by ethnicity, not by anything else, just by race. You could rank order them. You could do it by nose and head circumference. There were traits that Mediterraneans had or Alpines had. The Nordics were the best, by far the best. And the Nordics were sort of Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon definitely, but not all of the Europeans. As you got more southerly, the stock became weaker and worse. Jews, for all these people, posed the most serious threat to white supremacy, to Nordic supremacy in America. It was the start of replacement theory. Where have we heard that more recently? And actually Teddy Roosevelt coined this idea of race suicide. The Nordics, the whites, the Anglo-Saxons aren't producing enough. We're being swamped by the Poles, by the Jews from Russia, by the Germans, by the Spanish, by the Italians. They're coming in and taking our cities away from us. So what did they say we should do? And this is important to understanding Hobey and Percy, because the strategy was to encourage breeding of Nordics, to have more children, to sterilize the unfit 10% of society. Now, of course, unfit could mean a huge number of things to these people. Anti-miscegenation and segregation, because the argument was that if a white person has relations and children with an Italian person, they would default to the worst. You impure the gene. And end non-Nordic immigration. The other interesting thing is that the other close friend of Henry Fairfield Osborn and Moses Taylor Pine was Charles Scribner, who took over his dad's business and became Scribner Sons, which is now Simon & Schuster, who are publishing my book. Scribner was the publishing machine for all these white supremacist race science books. His lead editor, Max Perkins, was a very famous editor, Hemingway's editor, F. Scott Fitzgerald's editor, did also the Madison Grant books, the Henry Fairfield Osborn books. Scribner was the publishing house for that type of Anglo supremacy. And there was a very interesting, tiny world of elite American race scientists around Percy and Hobey that were involved in both conservation and eugenics. In fact, all the eugenics leaders were conservationists. The New Zoological Society, the Save the Redwoods, the American Museum of Natural History. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History today, you can see Osborn's bison opposite Madison Grant's bison in the exhibits. And so you can see that all of these groups, Moses Taylor Pine, Madison Grant, Henry Fairfield Osborn, Charles Davenport, Percy Rivington Pine, that is Moses's brother and Percy's uncle, and then Teddy Roosevelt. They're all involved in conservation and they're all involved in race science. The Half Moon Club is a remarkable, tiny elite institution that is these Teddy Roosevelt-like hunters that believe in preserving the purity of the best noble beast, which is the Nordic, the white. This is actually the inaugural Save the Redwoods in California grove. And here you can see Madison Grant, the leading white supremacist, next to Percy Rivington Pine, Moses Taylor's uncle. And just to illustrate the connections even further, you can see Teddy Roosevelt's very warm letter to Moses Taylor Pine. They were good friends. And you can see that Henry Fairfield Osborn and Moses Taylor Pine were both directors of the baseball team in 1877. They were best friends in college. This is significant because the eugenics movement begins to establish some type of legislative policy framework. And it starts off at this Half Moon Club, which is Teddy Roosevelt and others set up. And you can see that there was a very famous talk about eugenics, hereditary eugenics, by Princeton's chair of biology, Edwin Conklin, and it was seconded by Henry Fairfield Osborn. And look at these names: Madison Grant, Moses Taylor Pine, Charles Davenport, John Cadwallader, who we'll come back to in a second, and Henry Fairfield Osborn. These are the people who are close to government, and they're deciding and pressing for anti-immigration laws, miscegenation laws, and eugenic sterilization laws. What's the legacy of this movement? And you may think that I'm going off field here, but this is the context that Hobey and Percy and their love affair were existing within. Not just socially, but within the houses that they lived. Before World War I, there were 1 million immigrants to America each year. But this Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 capped it to 20,000, and only a few handful of people from Russia, from Poland, from Italy, and other places. You had to be basically Nordic, Anglo-Saxon to get in. Of course, there were no Asians at all. Asians were entirely banned from America from the mid-19th century until the late 1930s. There was a massive reduction in Jewish immigration because they were coming from Poland and Russia. And Hitler literally writes in Mein Kampf about being inspired by this law. And in fact, Hitler says that Madison Grant's book, the one that Moses Taylor Pine worked on, was his Bible. And it was the first book translated into German by the Nazis. And when you look at the Sterilization Acts, between 1920 and 1970, these men introduced and supported and got adopted sterilization acts in about 15 states, and about 65,000 people were sterilized in the United States all the way up until the 1970s. And again, the American Eugenics Society's draft, sort of an ALEC-type draft of legislation, was copied almost lock, stock and barrel by the Nazis for their Nuremberg laws in 1933. They even used Grant's book as a defense at Nuremberg, the Nazi leaders, saying, well, how can you punish us? You came up with these ideas. Wow. I do want to address this issue that, we're talking about Moses Taylor Pine and Pine Hall and the Pine Prize. And how, it was the time. That's how everybody thought. They were all racist. That's not empirically true. There was obviously a degree of underlying racism in America, but the specific, extreme eugenics race science laws were not held by a majority of people. It was a small, and again, echoes of today, a small and powerful elite that were pushing these very extremist laws. There's a nice little example I wanted to show you. Charles Davenport, one of the most famous eugenicists, hated the Italians, the Jews, and others. You can see from his quote that he didn't want them to sully the blood of pure Americans. And ironically, they called Americans, white Americans, Native Americans. They said they were native to America. But then there were other people. Another man, born in Connecticut a few years before, Charles Davenport, he founded the Italian Settlement Society. He spent his entire life helping Italian immigrants to New York, defending them, saying they were worthy, decent people, the Sicilians and the Southern Italians, they were good people, and he spent his entire life defending them. So he was from the same elite Mayflower type society, but he came to a totally different conclusion. Not everybody from white elite society thought like this. Do you want to have a guess who the other guy was? Any guesses?
Hobey's father?
No. Charles's brother. So
Wow.
we cannot say that elite American white Mayflower bred society were all about eugenics and racial superiority, because they weren't. And so sometimes when I hear this, oh well, that's just how they were, Woodrow Wilson or Witherspoon or whoever else, it's not actually true. But the interesting thing about coming back to Hobey and Percy's story is that Hobey was the epitome of the Nordic Adonis. When you read the letters about him, apparently straight men would gush over how beautiful he was. We have letters saying, I still have a photograph of Hobey in my bathroom that I look at every day. Supposedly straight man. They adored him. He was the iconic Nordic specimen. But the interesting thing for me, and I want to explore this more, is that Hobey betrays no sense of being racist in that way, of being superior. There is so much casual and vitriolic racism in all the letters and accounts that we have from the time. Hobey not once is racist about Chinese or African American or anybody else. In fact, he is friends, and Percy is friends with the famous jazz innovator James Reese Europe, who was from the Harlem Brigade, an African American soldier, and sort of invented jazz and brought it to Paris in 1916-17. And Percy is very close to James Reese Europe, and Hobey is close to him too. So it's almost like he's been anointed as the epitome of Nordic beauty, but he's very uncomfortable about that. So let me turn briefly right at the end of this to this idea about, before I've spent about a decade working closely on LGBTQ politics and representation, and I thought that things have got better. It was awful 120 years ago, and it's got slowly better, but no, it turns out, and if you read George Chauncey's great book, Gay New York, that before the First World War, there was a lot more space for men to have relationships with men. As long as you were masculine and you were with a masculine man, not a fairy, as they called them at the time, there was a huge amount of acceptance. Wealthy and working class men were allowed, if they weren't too overt about it, to have love affairs, to have sexual affairs, to be in relationships with other men. In fact, it's not until after the First World War that America really turns upon the gay man as the threat to society. So we have a time here where Hobey and Percy were in somewhat of a glass closet. They were there, people knew it, but they didn't really talk about it. And a lot of the attacks upon Hobey and Percy's, people saying, that's not true, how dare you insinuate that, were in the 1960s, when John Davis, the Princeton alumni writer who wrote the first biography of Hobey, asked his contemporaries about Hobey. They vitriolically said, do not suggest that they were in a relationship. But this is the 1960s, when of course it was a much more pernicious time for gay men in society. And so why were the American eugenics people, the race scientists, not that freaked out about homosexuality? The reality was that they were obsessed by race. They didn't really care that much about men being in relationships with men. And the other reality is that I've spoken to Madison Grant's biographer, Jonathan Spiro, who's a fabulous author, and he said, it's clear Madison Grant was gay. And there were a lot of characters who were gay at the head of the white supremacist race science movements. Let's go back to Hobey's story, because as many of you know, he died at the end of December 1918. Just before he died, came news that his best friend, if you remember back to St. Paul's, Alex Cadwallader, had died, had committed suicide, had broken into his father's gun case in Philadelphia and shot himself in the head. And it was all about his mental problems. And his relatives living today say that the family law was that Alex was gay and was never able to deal with that at the time. So Hobey, a few weeks before he finally dies, learns that his best friend from school has committed suicide, probably because he was gay. And what's interesting is, if you go back, again, these connections, if you go back to the Half Moon Society, you remember this guy, John Lambert Cadwallader. John Lambert Cadwallader was the Assistant Secretary of State under Ulysses Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the head of the New York Public Library. He was in the American Museum of Natural History and the Zoological Society, the Half Moon Club, and he actually, if you're a lawyer, founded the oldest law firm in America, Cadwallader, Wickham and Taft. John Lambert Cadwallader never married, and he never had children, and he preferred the company of men. And he took great joy in supporting and raising his niece, Beatrice Farrand. Does anybody know what Beatrice Farrand did? Yes, Historical Society for 10.
She designed the landscape design.
All of this, all of Princeton, the University Landscape Design is all Beatrice Farrand. Because John Cadwallader introduced her to Moses Taylor Pine, and Moses Taylor Pine said, oh, you should come do the grounds. And for 30, 40 years, she's one of the most famous landscape architects in America. And in a lovely other twist, who is Beatrix Farrand's aunt? Edith Wharton, Age of Innocence. Ah, so much for the movie. So, ending the story here. Hobey has his discharge papers in his pocket on December 18, 1918. The war's been over about 3 weeks. He says, I don't want to go home. He goes to headquarters. Headquarters says, you have to go home. And he says, well, let me take one last flight. Never use the phrase, one last flight. He takes the plane up. The engine cuts out. There's a longer story if you've heard the podcast. He thinks, and many times before would have just pancaked the plane down pretty successfully, but it goes head first. And unfortunately, he crashes. Hef Herring, his professor from Princeton, and Frank Lamb, who is literally the first American pilot. He was trained by Orville and Wilbur Wright. Pull him out of the wreckage. He had a huge gash in his forehead, no other injuries, and he died as Hef Herring put him in the ambulance. So it becomes front page news back in America. Our great sports hero, war hero, Hobey Baker, is dead. It was a massive thing. And they hold the memorial at Trinity Church, literally spitting distance from here. Everybody comes, J.P. Morgan, Woodrow Wilson, and they say goodbye to Hobey in a sort of Lawrence of Arabia type way. Now here's where the cover-up starts to perhaps happen. Hef Herring brings the Princeton professor, brings back Hobey's belongings from France. He says that somebody steals them from beneath his legs in the Paris train station, losing all the letters that Percy sent to Hobey. We have the letters Hobey sent to Percy, but we don't have the letters Percy sent to Hobey. But interestingly, we do have the cigarette case that Percy gave Hobey and inscribed it when they moved in together. That's over there in the special collections. You can hold it and look at it. But the letters were somehow lost, which is always a worrying sign. So, to cut a long story short, what does Percy do? He builds a massive mausoleum to his love, the Hobey Baker ice rink, which is over there. And I find it slightly ironic in this world that you have a massive memorial to gay same-sex love in the middle of campus that people don't really realise what it's for. But Percy builds the Hobey Baker ice rink. I really should have a massive rainbow flag, but I think the administration not quite ready for that yet. And so that's Hobey and Percy. I know you have questions, and I've gone on far too long, but it matters today. For those of you in the hockey world, we know from a lot of studies that young queer kids, in all sports, but especially hockey, feel threatened, feel bullied, they hear homophobic abuse, they drop out because it is horrible for them to play the game. And if they want to be hockey players, they hide themselves. And we know what that does to the psyche of any teenager. We know that the NHL has recently banned pride tape on sticks because it might offend the Russians. They ban pride nights and make it very difficult now. And Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, is very reticent about acknowledging any form of gay, bisexual inclusion. And that's why there have been 7,500 professional hockey players in America since 1917. How many out gay and bisexual? Yeah, 0. I mean, you even get gay soccer players. You get gay basketball players. No gay hockey players. So the fact that Hobey Baker, this iconic hockey player, was gay. He could have been bisexual. I don't think he was bisexual. I think he was gay. But he was same-sex loving. Is remarkable that hockey itself remains so close. All right. I shall stop, but thank you for your time. And any questions, I'm willing, happy to answer.
I have several, but if somebody else wants me to start with
I want to piggyback on kind of what you were just saying at the end there. So my son decided that the only thing keeping me out of the NHL is that I use pride tape on my stick. So I'm curious about.
I can see that.
But what's the response within the league? What's the response? You were talking the relationship, right, with ESPN.
Well, I would tell you, I was commissioned by ESPN Online to write an article about reactions to the podcast. I asked to speak to the Hobey Baker Award Committee. I asked to speak to Gary Bettman or other senior NHL officials. I asked to speak to Macklin Celebrini, who is the current Hobey Baker winner, who's just drafted to the San Jose Sharks. He's 17, 18. And I asked to speak to a couple of other people to gather their reactions to the story. What did they think about this? Not a single one would speak to me. And it's clear that at the NHL strong-armed ESPN very strongly to reduce the publicity for it. That's the reality. I mean, yeah. I was a little surprised in the sense that I didn't think the NHL would embrace it and start, jumping on pride parades, but I didn't think they would shut it down so extremely as they have. But they have. They refused to. It's don't say gay. It's like don't ask, don't tell.
So I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but then how does that reconcile with the You Can Play project, right? With Brian Burke and trying to defeat homophobia in hockey.
I mean, yeah. You know what? They wouldn't speak to me either.
Interesting.
There's internal, even within the advocacy, within the queer advocacy community, within sports and within hockey as well, I think there's a degree of, fragmentation. They don't know. So I think they see it as a third rail, a live wire that they don't want to touch. And I think the San Jose Sharks were, with Macklin Celebrini, originally they said yes, because I said I'd love to talk to him. He's the Hobey Baker winner, and I'm doing this story about Hobey Baker. Could I talk to him? And they said, of course. And they said, what's it about? And I said, well, there's this podcast. And they listened to the podcast and they said, no.
Wow.
Okay, he's not going to speak to you. So, yeah. It's sad, but that's what I can tell you.
I guess a couple questions. One of them being, you have it's a very illuminating podcast, and certainly very introspective to Hobey's life, his experiences. Yet I was wondering about the constraints you experienced in doing something that required so much research. I read that it took about 4 years to cobble together all the resources and put everything together. When something that is speculative to his personal identity, when all you have as one of your main primary resources is only letters from him, but not the other side, is sort of, what did that limit you in terms of fully creating the narrative and the story you wanted to tell?
Well, there was a lot more than the letters, and there's his actions, and one of the things our expert said was that the fact that Percy was known to be a gay man, and then Hobey went to live with him for 2 years, is an illustration that Hobey was comfortable with that. And we also have a lot of contemporary reflections on Hobey that all talk about his lack of interest in women and girls, and how he was really not able to sort of, he was, I mean, a lot of discussions about his comfort was in a male society. And even the vitriolic sort of attacks upon the taint of the suggestion that he was gay is sort of, people in the 1960s, when John Davis asked contemporaries for their recollections, he didn't ask them about whether Hobey and Percy were a couple, but they proactively wrote to him and said, don't you dare insinuate that. And so there's a lot, I mean, basically, we don't have definitive proof of his sexual relationship. I think we have definitive proof of his romantic relationship. But there are two things here. I think it's disingenuous to use this double standard, because if we looked at, as I said, a man and a woman with this type of context, we would reasonably presume that they were a couple. Same-sex relationships were much more common then than perhaps we would expect, and so this isn't shocking in any way. And I feel like we really, and I really tried to do sort of due diligence about not saying, I mean, I feel as though I'm an expert on politics, but not saying I'm deciding this. We went to David Doyle, to Nick Surratt, professors, went to Michael Bronsky at Harvard, went to a bunch of Jonathan Katz, we went to a bunch of LGBTQ historical experts and said, okay, here's the evidence that we have. What do you think? And all of them, to a person, said, we think this is a relationship, and it's inappropriate to sort of to not sort of lead with that.
And an add on that is that it's sort of a temptation when we're looking at things historically to look at it through a biased lens of like our contemporary, like, you know, our perceptions now of how things are, right? We say, we're looking back at the 60s, which is, you know, at least for a lot of people alive, that's still a period in which is in their time frame, and there's the lavender scare that certainly colors how we see our impressions of how same-sex relationships were perceived. But as you said, we found, you know, that in the early 1900s, that there was not quite that that scare around it. There was not that collective fear over somebody being perceived that way.
I mean, you know, some people have said, and you know, this question, why are you outing him, right? When and the reality is, at that time, he wasn't really in the closet, because the other thing is they didn't really think of this binary of gay and straight. You know, our experts on the tape said people thought of themselves as having passions, having loves, and they didn't necessarily think I'm gay or I'm straight. There was a continuum, and in some senses they were just recognizing the reality of human experience. And there was a continuum, and you could be married to a woman and actually very comfortably and happily married to a woman, but you also could have sexual relationships with men as well. And in certain circumstances and places, that was deemed acceptable. As long as
Invented, you know, in the 1990s. It's sort of
and there's another lovely quote from David Doyle, who's a professor at SMU, who says that, and I don't remember it exactly, but he said, our perceptions of relationships change over time, but the relationships itself exist. So the way we think about those two men from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, changes in our lens that society says we have this lens to look at. But they're always there. It's just how we look, what lens we're looking through. And sometimes it was so dangerous to be accused of that it was almost like, yeah, let's step away from that. But I'm comfortable in outing Hobey in a sense, because I also think the power, I mean, I always said as we were making this, and my children Mojave Milk book, which is around somewhere, I mean, it was like, you know, I said, I'm writing this for that 15-year-old kid in Ottawa who happens to be gay and has a really shit life and doesn't think they can be anything because there's nobody like them who's like that. And when I wrote that book, I got that 15-year-old kid in Ottawa writing to me and saying thank you, because I didn't think I could be a politician, because gay people can't be politicians. And then, you know, I mean, mean, and if one kid in Pittsburgh who plays hockey and happens to be bi or gay and thinks he can never do it because it's awful for him and knows Hobey Baker's gay, maybe, you know, it's like, okay, well, I'm allowed to do it. So that's why I think there's purchase in writing this history.
I think it's also elevating the history of people like our namesake, Bayard Rustin, who have been purposely forgotten and excised from the stories that are being told because of who they were, because of who they loved, because of how they presented. And so what you're really doing is giving voice to a very specific group of people who have been very specifically ignored.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Bayard Rustin case is obviously fascinating because he was, you know, somewhat abandoned by the movement as well. Right? This is not just white sort of racist society attacking him or Hoover. This is, you know, the NAACP and other, you know, leading civil rights organizations stepping away, even Martin Luther King, because he's toxic, because he's gay. And even if Martin Luther King says, I don't mind, but I'm going to have to distance myself from you, you know, it's the same issue with the gay hockey player. You know,
exactly.
The coach here, you know, that's the coach here at Princeton, you know, if a gay kid comes to him, we've never had an out gay hockey player at Princeton, right? It comes to him and says, I'm gay, and the coach says, well, I don't mind, but you really can't say anything. That's the same issue. I agree.
So if I can build on that, I coached at Princeton High School, not the university, but my two captains, the players, right? One is trans, and the other one, it's her 3rd wedding anniversary tonight, so she's probably not watching the podcast, but maybe later. How could I, as a coach, and some of these other youth hockey dads and coaches, how can we destigmatize or create that culture where people know it's okay to be who you are on the ice and in the locker rooms?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's incredibly difficult because you have such a machine of history, you know, and an ongoing machine trying to block that. I do think role modeling is so important. I mean, I know sometimes we can romanticize role modeling, but seeing somebody who you are reflected in achieving, whether it's a woman, whether it's an Asian American, whether it's a gay kid, whatever, that we know is such a shattering of your psychological inability to succeed. That once you, but that's not the only thing. I remember one of the shocking statistics that I saw when I was writing, maybe the Harvey Milk book, but, you know, African American kids and white kids in America historically scored very differently on the SATs, right? Black kids scored way lower, all else being equal, than white kids. When Barack Obama was inaugurated as president, the difference disappeared. And suddenly, black kids were scoring at the same level as white kids on the SAT because they felt they were allowed to succeed. That was the good news. The bad news was it lasted 6 months and then it went back. So it's like you can have a moment of psychological transformation, but there are so many other things that need to keep on enforcing it. And you know, I mean, the other thing is that I think a lot of sports around the world pay lip service to queer inclusion, right? I mean, I'm from England. I'm a big follower of English football, and you know, we've only had one out gay player in our history out of thousands of current players, and he committed suicide. And you know, a role modeling effect of just having one person come out would be massive. And we've seen role modeling effects at lower levels of American sports, but look at women's sports, look at women's soccer, look at women's, across the board, women have made dramatic gains in inclusivity in their sports, which has not been reflected on the male side at all. So I don't know what to say, because apart from being kind and decent and, you know, saying, I will have your back, it's really hard because you're only one cog in this bigger wheel, right?
Women also don't have as much to lose salary-wise as the men, I think. Perhaps they don't want to take that chance with their big paychecks.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
No, it's quite possible. Although you would have thought, actually, I mean, not to be sort of mercenary about it, but you know, if you have a big sports star coming out as gay, we'll get massive endorsements. Because everybody's going to be like throwing money at them. Oh, we really want somebody gay on our poster. You know, I mean, which is great, but you know, the other thing is that it's clear in English soccer that individuals don't want to come out. They don't want to be the first. They would happily come out as a group, and they would also come out second or third, but nobody wants to be first because suddenly that's all you are, right? You're no longer, you know, the left back for Nottingham Forest. You're the gay person, and that defines you, right? And the strength of Megan Rapinoe, or whatever, to say I'm going to be that person or Billie Jean King, or whatever, is remarkable because you get such a distraction from really what you know. You're focused on playing your game, right?
I would like to add to your answer that I think for coaches, for teachers, for anybody working with youth, that there's strength in community. It's certainly what we try and do here is provide a safe space at the Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice, whether it's in, you know, walk-in hours, or it's a youth group, or it's an education program. Like, there is strength in community, and there is strength in knowing you are not alone. There is strength in, you know, our monthly community breakfasts where you just come and you are in community with people. It speaks to exactly what you said, you know, that this isn't just lip service, right? It's about people who are on the ground willing to say, I am here, we are here, we, with open arms. I think there's strength in that.
No, I agree. And it's, you know, this issue of like good-natured silence, and just avoiding
Yes.
the difficult conversations. I mean, I'm a member, I love golf. It's terrible, I know, as a left-wing radical, but I do. And I'm a member at Springdale, which is a bizarre experience for me. And you know, our first president was Moses Taylor Pine, and our second president was Percy Rivington Pine. I mean, we had, like, you know, the leading eugenicist and then the leading gay person. Percy won the third NCAA golf tournament in 1899. You know, will Springdale celebrate our history? No.
So that's
shocking.
The third or fourth thing that you've mentioned in your research. So
Yeah.
native to Princeton,
Yeah.
your publishing house, all of the connections to problematic
Yeah.
historical people and events. How do you sort of reconcile participation in all of those avenues?
What in the sense of?
In the sense of, how do you play at the golf club knowing this is what the history is built on? I mean, your entire career is built on uplifting.
There's a Stonewall Golf Club in California.
I
wear my Stonewall thing. I have a wristband that is a rainbow, and all my golf balls, you know, you mark your golf ball, they're all marked in rainbows. And people, like, you know, you lose your golf ball and they're like, they know it's my ball. Because it's the gay ball. The gay balls, they know, literally. You're wandering around, if you're like around Springdale, you see like a gay golf ball, that's mine. No one else is doing that. It's tiny acts of rebellion. Very tiny.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. You are in the place using your body.
But to get on my soapbox briefly, I am less concerned about the 120-year-old historical legacy of Princeton, right? I'm not saying let's be obsessed by taking Moses Taylor Pine's name off everything, although I think that's a discussion. Because I actually think he was way worse than Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, they took Woodrow Wilson.
No, Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson followed Moses Taylor Pine. Woodrow Wilson said, yeah, that's not a bad idea. He didn't write it. Literally, Moses Taylor Pine was writing it. So poor old Woodrow loses, you know, I was in the School of International and Public Affairs. You know, he gets his name taken off that. He's not even, he's a fellow traveller. Anyway, Witherspoon, well, let's not start with Witherspoon. No, the thing, so that's one issue. But for me, I am much more appalled about the fact that Princeton is doing exactly the same thing today. I mean, this is a separate lecture, but I have published on this in a couple of journals, and I was doing research. But the central homophobic, transphobic, global legislative work happens within. This is the biggest court place. the Alliance for Defending Freedom, the American Principles Project, your next door neighbors, the Witherspoon Institute, literally there. I mean, the Heritage Foundation, they wrote some of Project 2025. They are drafting the anti-trans legislation across the states. I mean, the Madison program then trains people. The Blackstone Fellowship trains the lawyers. Amy Karen Barrett and everything. If you said, okay, I can show you a diagram, but not now. But if you said, where is the core of Christian nationalist legislative mobilization? It is here. And the university accepts that. And one of the reasons I'm not at Princeton anymore is that they stopped me working. So, I mean, I find that much more troubling. Because, and it's not just America, these people also advise Orban, Putin, Duda in Poland, in Hungary, in Russia. They're linked with the groups that advise Uganda, kill the gays in Uganda and the Ghanaian stuff, Caribbean as well. You know, it's 1 or 2 degrees of separation. They are mutually reinforcing institutes that work on, well, obviously anti-abortion, but primarily trans and gay stuff, and they see that as the wedge issue. And it's not like a random thing over in the world, it's here. It's literally here, on the campus at Princeton, and just off the campus at Princeton, which is then using the resources on campus at Princeton as well. And I find that despicable.
And I think you just answered why there will not be a big pride flag at Hobey Baker, right?
Yeah.
That sounds
And it's partly the donors. I mean, the donors at Princeton are of that side, by and large, more than the progressive side. So I was told I couldn't accept money for LGBTQ stuff because it would upset the donors that were supporting the people that you know.
So, do you think having this coming out, the story, Hobey Baker, is that going to impact at all the Hobey Baker Award, the perception?
Well, they refused to talk to me.
And so you think there's going to be no acknowledgement, you know, not even queer washing attempt or anything?
So far, no, just silence is the strategy.
Just ignore as if you didn't happen and this podcast didn't happen?
No, and so that's why the strategy is to like make it bigger and bigger.
So that you said you have a book coming in?
Yeah, we've just signed a contract for the book, which I think is great. But more importantly, we always envisaged this as a movie, as a TV show. And we made it as a podcast because we didn't have, first it was a documentary. And actually we spoke to this fabulous documentary guy called David France, who did How to Survive the Plague and Lifetimes of Marshall P. Johnson. And it was amazing. And he said, you know, I can't make a documentary without any footage because there's no footage at all. I forgot, he said, I'm not Ken Burns. What do you... So I'm sorry. He said, listen, get Ken Burns. Yeah, it's not gay enough. But anyway, but no, so Disney, I mean, the reality is that Disney own ESPN and Disney own FX. And we are in discussions with Disney to do the TV series version of Hobey and Percy.
And will it be fictionalized or will it be non-fictional?
No, it'll be this, it'll be non-fictionalized. As much as we can. I mean, you know, we haven't done a deal, but, you know, we're talking to them. They own it. They own it for 2 years. They own the IP, the intellectual property for 2 years. And so we could make it with somebody else after 2 years if they turn us down. But they get the first bite at it. Which again, if it's a TV series like Queen's Gambit or something, and it's any good, then it has more power. Then Princeton it's harder to ignore. Because we'll do a preview in the Garden Theatre over there with David Duchovny. With David Duchovny come back and like pretend he's an athlete again.
I was going to add that to Jeff's question there about, you know, how do you get more attention on this? Will this have any impact? And you're pointing out that there's an effort to suppress this, and I think that whenever there's an effort to suppress something, it always means that there's power if that thing is not suppressed. If there's more eyes on it, if there's more information. So I'm curious, from the standpoint of somebody who's a student and a teacher of history, should there be a concerted effort to start to reevaluate maybe historical figures, not in an effort to seek something out, but to maybe tell stories that weren't told before, to like illuminate something like Hobey.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean, I think hidden figure stories are so important. They're compelling, they're fun, they're interesting, and they teach us something, but they're also so powerful in changing views. Before I came here in North Carolina, I was working for a long time on the story of Pauline Murray, who was African American woman from Carolina, who was at the centerpiece of almost every civil rights action through the 20th century. A remarkable figure, sort of touching. I mean, literally wrote her senior thesis was Thurgood Marshall used in Brown versus Board of Education, and then she was one of the only black lawyers at this law firm, and her intern was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg used Paulie's work for Reed versus Reed, which was when Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued equality for women in the Supreme Court. And then Paulie was the first woman ordained as an Anglican priest in 1977. I mean, the other fascinating thing about Paulie was that her mother was enslaved in North Carolina around Chapel Hill by the people who gave the land and the money for the University of North Carolina. The brothers raped her grandmother, and Paulie was descended from the Smith family. And in 1940, she applied to go to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, literally being the granddaughter of the founder, and they said members of your race are not admitted. And so, and sorry, there's the kicker. She was trans. Yeah. She was what we would say today is transgender. She went to the hospital and said, I just must have male genitals secreted in me. I don't understand. I'm not a woman. And they locked her up in an insane asylum. But she went on to she was thrown off a bus for not moving 15 years before Rosa Parks was. And Thurgood Marshall said, "You're not a good plaintiff, you're too uppity." And so she was a remarkable figure. And again, it's a hidden figure. It's like we have this person out there, Rustin, who was a remarkable figure, but no one knows about him. So yes, I think hidden figure stories.
I think Andy just created our new lecture series for
The hidden
2025.
figures there. Maybe we keynote, organize this. It'd be great.
I love that.
Any questions in the audience at all? All right. Andy, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
I would love to just offer another round of applause.
No, I'm really, thank you for coming and staying out, and the Mets are playing for this. It's
Has your
great.
son been giving you updates?
No. I don't care that much. Yeah, but thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for everybody in person, and hello to all the people who are watching us on the live stream. This has been so incredibly generative and interesting beyond even just, I think, what we thought we were going to hear about, but how everything is tied and related and building on the history of these hidden figures, as you talked about. So thank you on behalf of the center. We invite you all to continue our incredible works and involvement. We have a very big, exciting event coming up at Lincoln Center, Rustin and Renaissance. You can check us out on social media if you want some more information.
I usually can see you on the live stream. We've got hundreds on the live stream.
Hello! So my name is Sarah Wasserman. I am the queer educator and local community organizer here at the Byard Rustin Center for Social Justice. Thrilled to have everybody here in partnership today. Hi to everybody who's watching. Thank you for being with us. We have an incredible community, wonderful events to share with you. As I mentioned, we are open every day as a dedicated safe space. But we also have wonderful programming, events, ongoing programming, support for queer youth, trans justice, reproductive rights. We really focus on the intersectional, and our book defenders, yay! There's an incredible amount of work happening here. We invite you to be a part of our journey and join us as angelic troublemakers. So please visit rustincenter.org for more information. And thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you.